Did the Jews kill Christ? You know, when I got involved in doing this YouTube channel and doing the podcast, I wanted to try to dedicate myself to really speaking about what it was I was thinking about on any given day. And to do so fearlessly and to forge forward. And this was what I was thinking about this morning as I was making my rounds. This is what I was grumbling about. Did the Jews kill Christ? So here goes. This is my brief analysis. The short answer is yes, the Jews did kill Christ. Now, if you're a Christian, of course, you believe that Jesus was the Christ. And I, of course, have an enormous amount of respect for that. And so you have to conclude that the Jews deliberately and consciously went about to kill the Messiah. From a Jewish perspective, I would suggest that the Jewish authorities at that time in Judea did not believe that Jesus was the Christ. They did not believe in his messiahship. If they had believed in it, they would have worshipped him. But they did not believe it, regardless of whether or not he was the Messiah. They did not believe it at that time. And thus, they believed that he was a false Messiah. And that he was, as such, a troublemaker, that he was creating problems for Judea at the time of the Roman occupation, when there had already been a lot of bloodshed and a lot of violence, and that the Judeans had lost their sovereignty essentially around the time of Jesus' birth, give or take, some years, and that they just felt at the time that it was his movement, which was very powerful and he was very influential, posed as an existential threat to Judea. They felt that the Romans were too strong and that the Romans would come in and they would crush Judea in response to any provocation of rebellion, which is how I think they viewed Jesus' movement. I think it's also how the Romans viewed Jesus' movement. They watched it with great fear and suspicion that the Jews, or the Judeans, were about to cause trouble and rebel. And thus, the Jewish authorities at that time recommended to the Roman authorities that Jesus be executed. Now, we can look in hindsight, and history, of course, has, as they say, hindsight is 20/20, and we can second-guess that decision. And hindsight tells me that it was a terrible decision, a huge mistake, one of the biggest mistakes in world history. Certainly if Jesus was the Messiah, but whether or not he was the Messiah, it was a major mistake because it created an opposition religion to Judaism. They would have been better off if they had simply sent him out to exile, or they had maybe had him arrested, or they ignored him. There would never have been a cross. There wouldn't have been a crucifixion. There wouldn't have been any of that. And, of course, as I say, history is 20/20, hindsight. But the fact is that the Jews at that time did recommend Jesus for execution. That doesn't mean all Jews did. I mean, I think that E. Michael Jones makes a very brilliant point when he says that the Japanese were responsible for Pearl Harbor. That doesn't mean that all Japanese people were responsible. Doesn't even mean that most of them were. The fact probably none of them even knew about it. It was done secretly. But Japan bears the responsibility and the blame for the Pearl Harbor bombing. And for that reason, the Jews at that time, the Judeans, were responsible for the execution of Jesus. They did decide that he should be executed. Again, I would contend they did it in the belief that he was not the Messiah, that he was a false Messiah. Thus, it was similar to, for example, the Roman Catholic Church deciding to burn Jan Hus at the stake because of his leading of a rebellion against Catholicism. The Hussites in Bohemia, they lured him in to have a meeting, and then they put him in prison, and they held him there for a year, and eventually they burned him at the stake. So, I see similarities there. The Jews felt that this leader was a threat to their faith, was a threat to their political power as well. And so they recommended him for execution. Now, where things get controversial, even more so, is a comment in the Gospel according to Matthew, where he says that the Jews who were gathered at the execution site, at the crucifixion site, were yelling out things like, "Crucify him, may his blood be on our heads forever." And that, of course, I would suggest is anti-Semitic, because it says that the Jewish people as a people bore collective responsibility forever for this particular act. And this is an idea that I don't believe it quite happened that way. I think it was put in there later by people who, didn't like the Jews and maybe slipped that little comment into the text. That's my opinion. But even if it were there, the fact is that Jews, the idea of holding an entire people collectively guilty for something for every generation, that is something it's not a Jewish idea. It's anathema to Judaism. It goes against the Torah. There are Torah comments, and I can't quote them, which say that the individual is not responsible for the sins of his father and grandfather. He is responsible for his own life. We can't be held responsible for the sins of our grandparents. It doesn't make sense. It was actually an ancient pagan approach that the Torah rejected as part of the revelation at Sinai, actually. That we're not held guilty, no one is, for the sins of generations past. Now, Michael Jones mentions in his book that during the Second Vatican Council, the Jews were hypocritical over this, because after all, were they not holding Germany responsible for the Holocaust and all Germans, and demanding that they pay reparations to the state of Israel, which, by the way, was always controversial in Israel. The Israelis were very uncomfortable about it. When this idea was first mentioned in Israel, there was riots, and Jews were getting out and turning cars over. They were so angry. They wouldn't not to take a dime from the Germans. But I would suggest that it's a little different there, because, first of all, the execution of Jesus was a Jewish affair. Jesus was a Jew or a Judean. Mary was a Judean. His followers were Judeans. The people that recommended him for execution were Judeans. Everyone involved in the whole story was a Judean. It wasn't, this wasn't a case of a crime against another group. Secondly, it was one man as opposed to 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. And thirdly, the Holocaust, the reparations are being made by Germany at a time when, people are still alive and who had their property confiscated. Families are still alive. And that German people are still alive who were involved in it. Or even if they weren't, Germany was involved in it. And so, therefore, one could say that reparations can be argued that they're appropriate. I'm not sure exactly how I fall on it, but you can make a case for it. Now, if they waited 100 years, I'd say not. Another example I would give, the Japanese reparation, for the internment, entirely appropriate, because the reparation was done 30 years after Japanese Americans had their property confiscated and they were put in internment camps during World War II, which is a terrible injustice. There was an inexact reparation for that, and there was an apology from the U.S. government, and it was done at a time when the people involved, many of them were still alive, their families were still alive, there was still direct memory of it. Perhaps a third example would be slavery. There's comments now about slavery, receiving reparations for slavery. The American people should pay African Americans reparations. I would suggest that should not happen, because we're talking about something that happened 150 years ago. Now, maybe right after the Civil War, in the immediate part of the 19th century, yes, that was an argument that could have been made, should have been made, was made, and was not fulfilled. But the idea of the Jewish people being responsible 2,000 years later for the execution of Jesus, it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense from a Judaic standpoint. I don't believe that the Jews actually said this, and even if they did say it, the Jews that happened to be there at that moment in the crowd, who was well whipped up into a frenzy, they were wrong. They were running completely against Jewish law and Jewish understanding. The only thing I'd add to that is that Jesus himself, hanging from the cross, said that I forgive you because you know not what you've done. Which is, in other words, he was saying that you're absolved of this because you don't realize that I'm the Messiah, and that you've done, you're operating under false assumptions, but you mean well. I mean, you're doing it because you're trying to protect your people, and you don't believe I'm the Messiah. And so, the whole argument is kind of moot if you actually believe, and if you do, and I encourage that Jesus was Christ, because Christ himself would have absolved the Jewish people of responsibility at the time of his own crucifixion. So this idea of carrying this on as the Jews killed Christ today is something that is just, it's a falsehood, and it's not really the right way to look at it. Now, that doesn't mean that the New Testament should be changed. I'm not suggesting that at all. I think that it should be understood and interpreted as that the Jewish people at that time made a colossal error, according to a Christian standpoint, and that they should be welcome to correct the error by becoming Christians. Again, I'm speaking here from a Christian standpoint. From a Jewish standpoint, I think that they view Jesus as having been a false Messiah. However, I personally, and not to get into a theological question, I tend to believe in the dual covenant idea, which is that whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus clearly was the most important man to ever live, because what he did, his ministry, and those who followed him, is that they brought the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah, which I do believe was divine and was given by God, to all of mankind, to the Gentile nations. And thus they embraced and they allowed into the covenant all of the world. And this was something that the Jews were supposed to do, but they never accomplished it. It was only through Jesus that this was accomplished, which I suppose could go to arguing that he was the Messiah. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that, and thank you for watching, everyone. This is Charles Moscowitz signing off.